Right now, somewhere on the planet, a newborn is screaming because it's 3 degrees too cold. It cannot fix this. It cannot ask for help in any language. It cannot move toward warmth on its own. If nobody responds in the next few hours, it dies. Not metaphorically, actually dies. And here's the thing that should bother you more than it probably does. For about 99% of human history, there was no modern medicine standing between that scream and that outcome. No incubator, no antibiotics, no formula, no NICUs, just other people. So when you ask how babies survived before modern medicine, you're not really asking a medical question. You're asking a social one. Because the honest answer is that babies didn't survive medicine's absence. They survived a system, a surprisingly sophisticated one, built entirely out of human bodies, human attention, and human knowledge, passed down with no internet, no textbooks, and no formal training at all. Let's start with the brutal number nobody likes to say out loud. For most of human history, somewhere between a third and half of all children died before age 5. Let that land. Not 1 in 100, not 1 in 20, 1 in 3, maybe closer to 1 in 2. That number stayed roughly stable for tens of thousands of years and only started collapsing in the last 200, mostly the last 100. So when we ask how babies survived, we have to be honest that an enormous number of them didn't. But that's exactly what makes the ones who did survive so fascinating, because their survival wasn't random luck stacked on top of random luck. There was a method, a crude one by our standards, refined slowly across thousands of generations through nothing but trial, error, and brutal consequence. The first piece of the method was temperature. A newborn cannot generate or hold body heat efficiently. Hypothermia in the first hours of life is one of the fastest, quietest killers in human history, and it still is in places without modern care today. The ancient solution was not technology. It was a human body. Constant skin contact with a caregiver, almost always the mother, kept the infant's temperature stable through direct heat transfer. This wasn't a parenting choice the way we'd think of it. It was closer to life support. Researchers studying traditional and hunter-gatherer societies have found that infants were carried against an adult's body for the overwhelming majority of their waking hours, and slept against one at night too, not in a crib down the hall, against skin, all night, every night, for months. The second piece was nutrition, and this is where things get genuinely strange to a modern audience. There was no formula, there were no calibrated baby foods. So what did infants eat once breast milk alone wasn't enough? Across an enormous range of ancient and traditional cultures, the answer was premastication. An adult chewed food until it was soft, then passed it directly into the infant's mouth. It sounds shocking by today's hygiene standards, and in some ways it was a real biological risk. But research into the practice has found something unexpected. It may have transferred beneficial oral bacteria from caregiver to infant, potentially giving the developing immune system a head start. Chimpanzees do the same thing with their young. It's likely a behavior nearly as old as our species itself. Beyond that, infants were given soft, calorie-dense foods as early as they could manage them. Marrow cracked out of bones, mashed roots and fruit, small pieces of fish. The diet was improvised, but it worked well enough that archaeological dental records actually show something surprising. Hunter-gatherer children frequently had better teeth and fewer cavities than children from early agricultural societies who lived mostly on grain, eating a chaotic variety of real food, it turns out. Beat eating a predictable amount of bread. Then there's the part of the system that's easiest to overlook because it doesn't look like medicine at all. Other people. In a hunter-gatherer band, an infant was almost never the responsibility of one adult. Mothers obviously did the bulk of the direct care, but they were nowhere near alone in it. Grandmothers, in particular, appear to have been critical. There's an actual scientific theory built around this, called the grandmother hypothesis, put forward by anthropologist Kristen Hawkes. It proposes that human menopause itself, which is bizarre and rare across the animal kingdom, evolved specifically because older women who stopped having their own children and instead helped raise their grandchildren measurably improved those children's odds of survival. Studies of traditional populations have repeatedly found that a child with a living, present grandmother has a significantly better chance of reaching adulthood. It wasn't just grandmothers either. Aunts, older siblings, and unrelated adults in the group all took on real caregiving responsibility. Fieldwork among the AKA people of Central Africa found fathers within arm's reach of their infants roughly 47% of the time, a level of paternal closeness that beats plenty of households today. The point is this: before medicine could save a baby from infection, the social structure around that baby was already doing an enormous amount of the work medicine does now. Constant monitoring, constant warmth, constant feeding, multiple sets of eyes that could catch a problem before it became fatal. Of course, eyes and warmth couldn't stop everything, and this is where the actual medical attempts come in. Primitive as they were, long before anyone understood germ theory, people understood empirically that certain plants help. Willow bark eased pain and fever. We now know it contains the compound that eventually became aspirin. Honey was used in ancient Egypt as a wound dressing, and it genuinely has antimicrobial properties. Garlic, used across countless cultures for infections, also has real measurable antimicrobial effects, identified purely through generations of watching what worked and what didn't. None of this could touch bacterial meningitis or severe dehydration from diarrheal disease, which were brutal, fast, and merciless killers of infants for most of human history. But it wasn't nothing, and it represents something important. Humans were running medical experiments on themselves for tens of thousands of years before they had any framework to explain the results, and some of those results were real. And when a child did die, which happened constantly, the response wasn't indifference. It's tempting to assume that because death was so common, it must have stopped hurting as much. The archaeological record says otherwise. Infant burial sites across cultures and across millennia are frequently arranged with deliberate care, sometimes with small grave goods, sometimes with flowers placed beside the body. Every documented human culture developed rituals around birth, naming, and childhood loss. Ceremonies that look like superstition to a modern observer, but that anthropologists argue served a real function. They bound a grieving community together. They gave people a structure for processing something that had no medical explanation at the time. Grief wasn't optional just because death was common. It was just more frequent. So how did babies actually survive before modern medicine? Mostly they survived because they were never left to survive alone. Warmth came from constant physical contact, functioning almost like a biological incubator made of another human's body. Nutrition came from improvised, empirically tested methods passed down through direct demonstration, not instruction manuals. Protection came from a dense, overlapping network of caregivers, where no single adult was ever the only line of defense. And when the system failed, which it did often and tragically, the community had rituals built to hold the grief instead of letting it shatter people in isolation. None of this means we should romanticize the past. A 30 to 50% child mortality rate is not a system to envy. The collapse of that number over the last 2 centuries, driven by germ theory, vaccines, antibiotics, and clean water, is one of the genuine triumphs of human history, and nobody should wish it away. But it's worth understanding that medicine wasn't the only thing keeping infants alive before medicine existed. Underneath the herbs and the rituals and the desperate improvisation was something quieter and arguably more powerful, an enormous distributed effort by an entire community, all aimed at keeping one fragile, helpless person breathing through the night. Before modern medicine, that effort was the medicine.